After more than 3 decades on death row, a man who spent his life fighting the system suddenly gave up, and no one knows why. His final hours were quiet, unsettling, and filled with decisions that left even prison officials confused. But the story behind that silence started long before he ever stepped into the execution chamber. Long before his name ever appeared in a courtroom, he was the kind of person neighborhoods felt comfortable around. A quiet carpenter, always polite, always reliable, moving from house to house in one of Panama City Beach's most relaxed communities. People let him into their homes without a second thought. They offered him coffee, shared stories, handed him keys so he could work while they were away. And to anyone watching, he blended in perfectly, just another worker trying to make an honest living. But behind that easy smile was someone paying attention to far more than the broken cabinets or loose floorboards. He noticed routines, valuables, who came and went, and which houses kept cash tucked away instead of in a bank. And the more familiar he became to the people living there, the easier it was for him to move unseen. That's exactly how he worked his way into the confidence of the Pettibone family. They trusted him enough to leave him alone in their home, certain he was the kind of man who helped the neighborhood run smoothly. What they didn't know was that the trust they were building was feeding something else inside him, quiet ambition, and a growing interest in what he believed the family wasn't telling him. And once he sensed opportunity, the life he showed the world and the one he lived in the shadows began drifting dangerously close together, but he wasn't done testing the limits yet. The real turning point didn't happen inside a house or during a job. It happened in the middle of a crowded shopping mall. He ran into Tressa and her 2 kids by chance, a simple conversation that should have meant nothing. But one sentence changed everything. She mentioned her husband was out of town on business, said it casually, the way anyone would. For her, it was small talk. For him, it was the opening he'd been waiting for. He didn't leave after that. He stayed back, watching from a distance as the family wandered store to store. It wasn't curiosity, it was calculation. He studied the kids, the timing, the small details most people overlook. And then he made his move. He approached the youngest child, a boy who already knew him as the friendly worker from their home. That familiarity made everything easier. He started asking questions, simple ones at first, then more direct. When school started, when it ended, when their father would return. The boy, thinking nothing of it, answered honestly. And with every answer, the last pieces of his plan fell into place. By the time the family walked out of that mall, he already knew the exact moment the house would be unprotected. And once he had that information, he didn't hesitate, because what he wanted wasn't friendship or trust anymore. It was access. And the opportunity he'd been waiting for was only days away. When the day finally came, everything unfolded with a level of precision that showed just how long he'd been planning it. Around 3 in the afternoon, Tressa was alone, exactly the situation he'd mapped out days earlier. There was no forced entry, no broken lock. He slipped inside using the copy of the key the family had trusted him with, walking into the house as if he still belonged there. He wasn't driven by rage or chaos. He came with a single objective: money he was certain the family kept hidden. And because he'd spent weeks gathering information, he believed he knew exactly how to get it. But when Tressa refused to tell him anything, his calm planning twisted into something far more dangerous. For more than 20 minutes, he tried to force her to reveal where the cash was hidden, using zip ties he'd brought with him and intimidation meant to break her will. But she never told him a thing. Not a hint, not a direction, nothing. Even terrified and alone, she held that secret. Frustrated and out of control, he ended the confrontation with sudden violence. And the moment he realized she wasn't getting up again, his focus snapped straight back to the only thing he cared about: finding the money. He tore through the house in a frantic search, grabbing anything that looked valuable: jewelry, sunglasses, even the family's dark Mercedes. But the one thing he wanted most, the cash he believed was inside, never appeared. She had kept that secret to the end. And while he fled the neighborhood thinking he had escaped, someone else was already on their way home, and about to walk straight into a nightmare they would never be able to forget. Just 15 minutes after he rushed out of the neighborhood, the front door opened again, this time to an 8-year-old boy coming home from school like it was any other afternoon. Bart stepped into the kitchen expecting the usual sounds of his mom finishing up chores or talking on the phone. Instead, silence filled the house. A few steps later, his entire world collapsed. In that moment, his childhood ended without warning. The image he walked into, shocking, confusing, impossible to understand at his age, would stay with him for the rest of his life. Neighbors later said they could hear him screaming for help, a sound that spread through the community like a shockwave. Within minutes, police and first responders swarmed the home, trying to piece together what had happened. And as soon as detectives understood the brutality of the scene, they also realized something else. Whoever did this knew the family, knew the layout, knew the routines, knew exactly when the house would be empty. And that narrowed their search fast. Because there was one person who fit every detail, and had vanished the same afternoon. Once detectives zeroed in on him, the pieces started falling into place almost immediately. The first major break came when a local pawn shop reported a gold chain that matched one missing from the family home. It wasn't just similar, it carried traces that linked it straight back to the crime scene. That alone pushed him to the top of the suspect list. But investigators didn't stop there. They tracked down a friend who admitted he'd been gifted a pair of high-end sunglasses the same day the attack took place. Sunglasses identical to the ones Tressa's husband said were gone. And then came the detail that erased any remaining doubt. Inside his vehicle, police found plastic zip ties. The exact same brand, same size, same type used inside the house. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern forming with every new discovery. And just when detectives thought they understood who they were dealing with, another truth surfaced. He wasn't some inexperienced neighbor who snapped under pressure. By that point in 1989, he already had 8 prior convictions. He knew how to move in 2 worlds. One where he looked like the helpful carpenter people trusted, and another where he operated like someone with a long history of crossing lines most people never would. With all the evidence stacked against him, the case built itself. And while prosecutors prepared for trial, he made a move that surprised even the people who knew his past best. While the case against him was tightening, he pulled off something no one expected, not in a county jail, and definitely not while awaiting a capital trial. In 1990, he managed to break out of what was supposed to be Florida's first, modern, privatized facility, and exposed just how unprepared it really was. It started during a conjugal visit, when his wife quietly passed him hidden saw blades. From there, he teamed up with 4 other inmates and began cutting through the metal frame of their cell piece by piece. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't elegant, but somehow, no one noticed. Once they carved out enough space, they went for the window, 6 floors up. They tied sheets together, dropped the makeshift rope out into the night, and climbed down into open air like it was a movie scene gone wrong. And for a few hours, it worked. They actually got out. But freedom didn't last. Almost every escapee, including him, was caught before the sun came up. The whole operation revealed more about the prison's failures than their cleverness. Still, the jailbreak showed something important about him. He wasn't the calm, calculating planner prosecutors later described. He was unpredictable, desperate, and willing to take risks that made no sense for someone facing a death sentence. And as the years rolled on, that desperation followed him straight into the appeals process, and eventually into one final decision almost no one saw coming. After the failed escape, the rest of his life unfolded inside a small cell on Florida's death row. Decade after decade, he filed appeal after appeal, challenging evidence, sentencing, procedures, anything that might slow the clock. And for a long time, it worked. His case moved through state courts, federal courts, even up to the U.S. Supreme Court, always ending the same way. Denied, but still alive to file another motion. He became one of those inmates people thought would never actually face an execution date. Too many appeals, too many delays, too many legal twists, until Florida began resuming executions in late 2025. That shift changed everything. When the governor signed a new order setting his execution for December 9, it should have triggered another round of legal battles. But instead, he stunned everyone. He contacted the courts and asked to waive every remaining appeal he had left. No explanation, no note, no attempt to justify the sudden turnaround. For someone who had spent 35 years fighting every step, the move felt abrupt, almost eerie. Attorneys called it unusual. Observers called it unsettling. It was the kind of decision that left people wondering what had shifted inside him after so many years of resisting. And once that request was approved, the countdown started, quietly, without the chaos or last-minute filings death row cases are known for. Which brings us to the morning of December 9th, when his final hours began long before the sun came up. His last day began in the kind of stillness most people never experience. At 4 a.m., he stepped out of his bunk, showered, and prepared for a routine that wasn't routine at all. A spiritual advisor visited him, one of the only human interactions he had that morning. There were no phone calls, no letters, no family standing by. After more than 3 decades of appeals, arguments, and legal noise, his final hours were almost unnervingly quiet. As the afternoon faded, he was brought into the execution chamber. Witnesses described him as calm, eyes down, not speaking to anyone. When officials asked if he had any last words, he didn't even lift his head. He stayed silent, choosing not to say a single thing on the record. At 6 p.m., the procedure began. Technicians struggled at first to set the IV, but within minutes, the fluid started to move. He shifted slightly, gasped once, then went still. The room stayed silent except for the steady instructions of the medical team. At 6:30 p.m., the doctor pronounced him gone. But the most striking detail wasn't how he died, it was the absence in the room. A few distant relatives of the victim were present, but the one person people expected to see wasn't there. Bart, the boy who came home to a nightmare at just 8 years old, had passed away in 2022. He never witnessed the final moment of the man responsible for destroying his childhood. And that imbalance, decades of appeals, years of waiting, and no direct closure for the person most affected, left many wondering what justice really meant in this case. In the end, his silence left more questions than answers. And whatever changed inside him during those final weeks, went with him. When you look at the full story, it's hard to ignore how sharply the two halves of his life split apart. On the surface, he was the man neighbors trusted with their homes. Beneath that, he was building a plan that would shatter a family and send a community into years of grief and confusion. And even after decades behind bars, the choices he made continued to twist in unexpected directions. What still unsettles people today is the sudden shift near the end, the moment he stopped fighting the very system he'd battled for more than 30 years. No confession, no explanation, not even a final sentence to mark the end of his story. Just silence. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was acceptance, or maybe it was something only he understood. But one thing is clear, the impact of what happened didn't end with his execution. The people left behind carried the weight far longer than he ever did, and some never lived long enough to see the final moment play out. In the end, his death closed a legal chapter, but the questions surrounding it are still very much alive.